Since the announcement of James Gunn's DCU, one of the most anticipated projects / characters that we've been waiting to see is Batman and his movie, Batman Brave and the Bold. And this is obviously for a multitude of reasons. Even though we've had a ton of Batman media in live action, this is still going to be the first time in live action that we get a Batman who has his entire Bat family and also is in a shared universe with every other superhero in the DC universe. Not to mention, this version of Batman will also embrace all of the comic booky fantastical elements of the character that are desperately needed. So the appeal for this version of the character is obviously very high. That being said, in the past couple of days we learned some new information about this movie that now has the fandom split in terms of if this movie is going to be a quality Batman project. So in this video I'm going to go over if we should actually be worried about this new information. But very quickly before we do that, if you enjoy the content, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and also hit that hype button. Diving right into the video, as far as Brave and the Bold updates are concerned, this is probably the first major update that we've had since it's been announced, considering the fact that James Gunn is adamant about not giving real details about things until there is an actionable script. And this obviously makes sense because you don't want to give fans false hope. Because of this being the case, all we knew about Brave and the Bold is that it would be a story about Batman and his son Damian Wayne. It would also help to establish the larger Bat family in the DCU. We were also told that this movie would largely be adapting Grant Morrison's Batman and Son arc. And on top of this, Andy Muschietti was actually locked in to be the director for Brave and the Bold when it was announced. However, since the release of the Flash film, a lot of fans have completely turned their back on Andy Muschietti, thinking that he's not competent enough to take on the likes of Batman. Now personally, I'm not a part of that camp because I don't think that the problems that existed in the Flash movie were necessarily the fault of Andy Muschietti. Things like poor VFX, a sloppy DCEU continuity, and also in my opinion a miscast of Barry Allen and Ezra Miller are again all things that are technically out of Andy Muschietti's control and would have been present regardless of who directed the film. A lot of people also took issue with Andy Muschietti blaming the poor reception of the Flash movie on people not really liking Flash in the general audience and mostly putting the blame on women not getting into the theaters. And while I can understand people's frustration because of the lack of accountability in this statement, you have to kind of think of it from a business perspective because of the fact that Andy Muschietti is working with WB. If things happen behind the scenes that were the fault of WB, Andy Muschietti can't take it upon himself to publicly bash the people that were involved with the Flash film because of the fact that he has to actively work with said people. So he was just never going to say that the studio is the reason why the Flash movie turned out bad. Nor was he going to put the blame on himself because again, the VFX and things of that nature just aren't on him. That being said, since Andy Muschietti was initially announced to be the director of Brave and the Bold, it seems like he's pretty much been kept in the dark with things that have been going on with the film. And this is presumably because of the backlash that the Flash movie received, especially when you consider that Andy Muschietti was hired before it was actually released to the public. And because of the fact that James Gunn and company probably weren't expecting the amount of backlash that it received, they're now more open to the idea of searching for other options after the script is completed. And this not only comes from statements from James Gunn and Peter Safran saying that Andy Muschietti effectively isn't involved in the writing process of this film and will only be shown the script once it's completed, and also new reports suggesting that Andy Muschietti may not actually direct Brave and the Bold for a multitude of reasons. One of those reasons being availability, considering that Andy Muschietti just dropped It Welcome to Derry season 1 and it was a massive success for HBO, so they're looking to fast track season 2, which again will require Andy Muschietti to return to direct. If Brave and the Bold is ready to go around that time, Andy Muschietti will not be able to do both projects at once, so he'll logically have to choose between the two, and I'm pretty sure he's like contractually bound to the It series. As far as the other reasons, the article itself doesn't really say, but we the audience can obviously make logical deductions. As far as the writing is concerned for the Brave and the Bold, for the longest time we had no idea who the scriptwriter was for said film because of the fact that Gunn didn't want to put any stress on the guy, and this is something that he is quoted saying. Gunn himself has also more recently come out and said things like he's a driving force for the script because of the fact that he's always had a very distinct vision for the character of Batman in this universe and for Brave and the Bold itself. He's also said very consistently that he's working very closely with the writer of this movie. Since Gunn made those statements, it was then reported by very reputable scooper Apocalyptic Horseman that they had actually changed writers for Brave and the Bold a while back. And then a few weeks later, we actually got the official news that Christina Hodson, the same woman who wrote the Flash movie, is going to be penning the Brave and the Bold script. And when this news was revealed, obviously the fandom went nuts. And not in a good way. And initially, I'm not even gonna lie to you guys, I felt the same way because if you just look at Christina Hodson's track record at face value, it's obviously not the best. For those of you who don't know, obviously Christina Hodson wrote the Flash movie. She was also responsible for the script of Birds of Prey. She was also responsible for the unreleased Batgirl movie that was stated to be so horrible by Peter Safran that it was unreleasable. And she overall just doesn't have many good credits to her name outside of Bumblebee. That being said, in the past, James Gunn has openly said that he thinks that she's a phenomenal scriptwriter. And Peter Safran, who is a co-CEO with James Gunn and canceled the Batgirl movie, was fine with her being hired to write Brave and the Bold. So it made me do some thinking. If they hired her for Brave and the Bold, despite her track record, there has to be more to this that we don't know. So that's what I went to go do research on, and boy was I surprised that there's actually a lot of heavy context to the failures that she's had at DC Studios or at WB. And just to clarify, when I say failures, this isn't me trying to come at Christina Hodson as a writer. I'm just saying the objective reception from these films, they're just not deemed to be that good. And again, in her defense, after doing research, a lot of these films aren't good, but it's not really her fault. Starting with Birds of Prey, a film that she wrote that received a ton of flack. Now, the main reason as to why this film got the criticisms that it received is because a lot of the Birds of Prey members were completely written out of character, predominantly Cassandra Cain, but there was also unnecessary race swaps like race swapping Black Canary, and the movie overall was just a complete deviation from what the Birds of Prey are traditionally shown to be in the source material. That being said, again, this was not Christina Hodson's fault, and we know this because popular Birds of Prey comic writer Gail Simone, who actually wrote one of the best Birds of Prey runs of all time, came out and said that the filmmakers actually wanted a comic accurate Cassandra Cain and presumably a more comic accurate Birds of Prey team. However, when trying to pitch this to Warner Bros at the time, they lost that battle. On top of that, this movie also came out around the time where DC was heavily pushing Harley Quinn. So because of this, they opted for Harley Quinn to be the main character of the Birds of Prey, and Margot Robbie's vision for the film also involved changing the dynamics of the surrounding characters to serve the story of Harley Quinn over the story of the Birds of Prey, which is obviously Huntress, Black Canary, Barbara Gordon, etc., etc. So long story short, Christina Hodson and whoever else worked on the film simply couldn't adapt a comic accurate Birds of Prey movie because of the fact that the studio just didn't want that at the time. The next movie that Christina Hodson receives flack for is obviously the unreleased Batgirl movie. And like I mentioned earlier, this one is noteworthy because of the fact that Peter Safran, one of the co-CEOs of the current DC studios, said himself that this movie was not releasable, meaning that whatever was in this movie was so bad that it could potentially have long-lasting damage to the DC brand itself. That being said, when doing research, the reasons as to why this movie was considered unreleasable was largely due to the movie having unfinished VFX that wouldn't have been ready on time. Another issue with this film is that it was also contradicting the new DCU vision. The film was meant to establish Batgirl as a future cornerstone of DC, and for those of you who don't remember, this was around that time where Batgirl and Supergirl were rumored to be replacing Batman and Superman as the pillars of DC in live action, which was inherently just a dumb idea to begin with. But nonetheless, with James Gunn and Peter Safran stepping into the picture, it just made no sense to release this film, especially when they're about to launch their entire new universe. And could you imagine the type of backlash that this film would have received if they actually went through with replacing Batman and Superman with Supergirl and Batgirl, and they started that agenda with this movie? Another thing we also don't know about this film is the types of performances that we got from the actors in said film. Now, this isn't me in any way trying to come at the cast of this movie because I'm sure that they're all talented actors. However, sometimes some things just don't work out and you don't give your best performance. That could have also very well been a possibility as to why Peter Safran deemed that this movie was unreleasable. And the reason why I lean towards that being more likely than Christina Hodson having a bad script for this movie is specifically because of the fact that Peter Safran and James Gunn are still in charge, and they chose to not only hire Christina Hodson to write Brave and the Bold, but she's also one of the main architects for the 10-year plan that we have for the DCU currently. So obviously they trust her writing skills. That being said, we now move into the Flash movie, which is the main catalyst for all of this backlash in the first place. Now, first things first, everyone knows that the Flash was going through development hell. The movie was simply being developed at a time in which WB had no idea what they were doing with the DC IP. Because of this, the movie went through several director and script changes, starting with the likes of Seth Grahame-Smith, then moving on to Rick Famuyiwa. I don't know how to say that last name, I'm sorry if I butchered it. Then the duo of John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein, and then they finally settled with Andy Muschietti and Christina Hodson. Then on top of that, you add Ezra Miller's controversy with his legal troubles, tight deadlines on the visual effects team because of the chaotic production process, and voila, you end up with The Flash 2023, which still wasn't that horrible of a movie considering all of these things happening behind the scenes, but definitely wasn't a banger. And for what it's worth, a lot of the Batman moments in this movie were the best parts of the film. Obviously not including the horrible comedic scene with Wonder Woman in the Lasso of Truth and Batman saying that he could just end poverty to stop crime, which if you read anything about Batman, you know is just a horrible mischaracterization and something that he already utilizes his money to do. Again, the Batman moments moments in this movie just aren't bad. And believe it or not, Ben Affleck actually said that he started to truly understand the character of Batman because of this movie, because I'm not gonna lie, Christina Hodson wrote him some pretty good scenes in this movie, especially the scene where he's talking to Barry about not doing the time travel. That's one of the best written Batman scenes that we've gotten in live action. So long story short, a lot of the shortcomings of Christina Hodson aren't really her shortcomings, they're shortcomings of WB as a whole, and everyone knows that WB, before James Gunn and Peter Safran stepped in, at least with the DC aspect of things, was just horrible. And on top of that, like I mentioned earlier, I truly believe that part of the reason why the Flash movie isn't well received by a lot of people isn't because of the actual script itself. I think Ezra Miller is genuinely just miscast as Barry Allen. So a lot of his line delivery, how he portrays the character, a lot of it is just off-putting. And this isn't me saying that Ezra Miller is a bad actor by any means, but when you see Ezra Miller's performance, he just doesn't feel like Barry Allen at all. And at times, I'm sorry, he's just a little bit too flamboyant. And it's genuinely to the point where it takes you out of the scene sometimes because of how horrible it is. It doesn't feel like he's playing the character of Barry Allen. It feels like Ezra Miller is just acting out the script as himself. And this isn't a Flash 2023 exclusive thing. I felt this way about Ezra Miller as Flash in every DCEU movie that he appeared in, including Zack Snyder's Justice League. That being said, I do ultimately understand the fans who are concerned with this choice, because even if we want to give Christina Hodson the benefit of the doubt, it still begs the question, why didn't we get a higher prestige writer, or why didn't they have other options to come and write this script? A lot of fans, including myself, are saying you guys had the likes of Drew Goddard in the creative room right with you. Why didn't you guys just go to him? He's responsible for things like Netflix's Daredevil series. But again, all this says to me is that James Gunn and company really trust Christina Hodson with this script, especially when you take into account that James Gunn has said numerous amounts of times that Batman is his favorite character, and he's even quoted recently saying that if you're going to make a Batman movie, it better be effing awesome. And even when you hear James Gunn talk about the character of Batman, it's obvious that he understands the character, and it's obvious that he's read the source material. He's even on record saying that his favorite era of Batman comics is the early 70s and 80s comics of Batman that were written by Dennis O'Neil and drawn by Neil Adams. That coincidentally is also my favorite era of Batman comics, and I wasn't even alive then. I just went back and read the comics from that time, and to me, that's just the best characterization of Batman, that era. Obviously, he has other good areas that extend to the Bat family, but for Batman himself, I think that the 70s and 80s were when he was characterized the best. And it's because of the 70s and 80s that we have the Batman that we know and love today. The 90s and 2000s were all progressions of what we got developed in the 70s and 80s. As far as Andy Muschietti is concerned, I'm completely fine if Andy Muschietti stays on to direct. However, if you have someone like Sam Raimi who's on record begging to do a Batman film and saying that he loves DC Studios and really wants to do more comic book movies, even going as far as to say that if he were to do Batman or any DC character, he would want the story to be something that's true to the source material but is still a part of their real universe, not something that disappoints the fans, and something that is based on stuff that the fans love and brings out the best moments for those characters and their proper conflicts or the right challenges for the right hero. With Sam Raimi talking like that, I feel like you just hand him the Batman movie. That's just me personally. And again, this isn't a slight to Andy Muschietti at all, but Sam Raimi made Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 is to a lot of people not only the greatest Spider-Man movie that we've ever gotten, but also arguably the greatest comic book movie that we've ever gotten. To me, if Sam Raimi asked to do Batman, you just let Sam Raimi do Batman. That's just me personally. But overall, I don't think that we should panic about the DCU Batman yet. It's obvious that James Gunn and company have a lot of faith in Christina Hodson. And when you add the context of what she went through with her past DC movies, it makes sense in why they turned out the way that they did. On top of that, you add James Gunn literally saying time and time again that he's a major driving force for Brave and the Bold and that he's working very closely with the writer. I think that we should give this movie a fair shake. And as long as Christina Hodson doesn't write Batman like how he's written in the Wonder Woman lasso scene from The Flash, and more like how he's written when he's talking to Barry about time travel, I think that the DCU Batman is in great hands. With that being said, that is going to wrap up this video, ladies and gentlemen. If you enjoyed this video, again, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Also hit that hype button. And as always, it's been K the God. I'll catch you boys in the next one.